Okay, hello. This is episode 65 of the Following Mechanical Turks project. So today, what we're going to look at is we're kind of in the home stretch with the second product. The things that were sort of outstanding in terms of compiling the bibliography and cutting video clips, so material that's kind of ancillary. Those have been wrapped up. So, Nathaniel, I think there was some stuff you were considering adding to, I think, ultimately the conclusion, right?
Yeah, there was two, well, one in particular, a piece, what was the date on this? The little earlier this year, it was a piece by Stephen Johnson, who's sort of famous for, invention of air and everything bad is good for you, but wrote a piece in the New York Times Magazine about largely like GPT-3 and then the kind of large language approach to teaching, computers to write. And it's pretty interesting piece. I mean, it sort of, rehashes the conversation that's happening in, more niche spaces on the internet for a potentially broader audience. But what's sort of frustrating about it is it essentially, right, it's writing about writing and readability, but it doesn't explore any of the sort of core terminology, right? The idea that we already know what sentience is, we already know what intelligence is, and the idea is that we're going and, right, it won't be actual writing until we recognize it as our kind of writing.
Mm-hmm.
And gets at some interesting things around like intent, right? Like the sort of the question of, is this text meaningful or not, hinges on whether or not it's intended to be meaningful. Right? So it's a kind of Platonic uptake of what this writing is, that the idea that meaning is not, a function of relationships. And then what's really compelling, I think, from the standpoint of rhetoric, is there's a kind of deep-seated Platonism, both in the idea of sort of pure ideal forms of intelligence, right? There's a Platonic human that exists independent of its relationships or its embodiment or whatever. But the fears about computer-generated writing are very resonant of Plato's fears about rhetoric generally, which is, right, do they know what they're saying?
Yeah.
It will potentially spread misinformation, right? All the anxieties about computer-generated discourse strike me as like, well, this is always the problem of discourse, which is, right, whether it's intended or not, and how things can become translated and transmuted, right? So there's this really compelling thing about it. So when I was originally thinking about this as potentially as part of the introduction, is that as I'm reading it going like, this person, as I frequently think when I read Stephen Johnson, right, that rhetorical theory would really help intensify the argument here, which is that one of the things that makes this conversation hit a wall in terms of its interest is it's not using computer generated writing to rethink any of the kind of fundamental categories.
Yeah.
Right.
It's using those as givens.
Right. And then all that it can be is does this measure up to this? Right. But pretty much assumes that it knows what, sentience is, what intelligence is, what meaning is, what ethics might be, right? So there's this fear of what if computer generated text says the wrong thing, which is, Plato's fear about, well, what if you teach someone to say the wrong thing? Well, right, that's a risk that's implicit in the emergence of a discourse. But the more I thought about it, the more I think it actually works as a conclusion, because I think it links back up to the opening, right? That we kind of open with these anxieties around this.
Okay.
And then Johnson sort of coheres those anxieties, particularly around questions of writing, and I think things that, again, right, that rhetoric is well positioned to do more with, right? Not just contribute to this, but actually shift the grounds of the conversation itself. And I think there's a way that I can use that in the conclusion to kind of affirm our approach, but also I think signal that, right, so that the kind of further research thing that happens in the conclusion is that what we've that the takeaway of the first product and the takeaway of the second product is kind of what we've been thinking all along, which is that we're not going into Mechanical Turks to measure what's happening in there against some idealized version of human intelligence and readability. Is that we're interested in sort of what theory is happening in Mechanical Turks. And this Johnson piece, which I think we can kind of treat as a, I think because of his popularity and the position of this, right, this is a much more publicly visible articulation of this.
Yeah.
That becomes the, like, no, this conversation needs more, it needs a different theoretical framework. And that's what subsequently needs to be developed, which is the theoretical framework that isn't applied to something like Mechanical Turks or GPT-3, but a theoretical framework that's emergent from it. And that's kind of the idea that we have for the third piece.
Third piece is how it's doing theory or theorizing in operations. Yeah, so I mean, I think that's a good idea. That was because when you were talking about this, my initial response is, well, you often want to be careful about introducing new concepts in the conclusion. So I was like, is that the end of this, or is it the start of the next one? But as you're describing it, I think if it's structured as what we're doing here in the conclusion is returning to the beginning, which does start with, as you point out, similar espoused anxieties in popular media, right? I mean, it literally starts with, right, GPT-3 can summarize books as well as a human can boast the title of a 2021 news article from the technology website Boing Boing. So it's like, it's a similar, I never know a good term for things that are, I mean, the pejorative, but I think it actually works well as middle brow, like the Atlantic,
Yeah.
But is there a term for that isn't insulting? But I mean, it's like a smarter popular source,
Yeah, it's not. I mean, it's Atlantic. It's not Newsweek.
Right, but I've never.
But it's not. It's not Theory, Culture, and Society.
Yeah, I keep running into this issue, particularly with students, where I talk about the Atlantic or the New Yorker, things that are. It's like I always have to say, the most common term is middle brow, but that's kind of pejorative. But I don't know if there's a good word for more intellectual periodical publication that isn't scholarship, but also isn't just a blog churn.
Maybe I'll tweet that out. We're looking for what's the non-pejorative way to describe the Atlantic and New York Times Magazine and we don't want to say middle brow.
Yeah, not middle brow.
Because that seems pejorative and it's an academic piece, and so middle brow just seems. That's a middle brow move to make. We want a non-middle brow term for middle brow.
Right, exactly. But anywho, I mean, so if the conclusion returns to those anxieties as espoused in popular texts as a way of pointing toward what's missing in those things is a theorizing of a priori concepts.
Yeah, and
that potentially we can see operating in the operations of MTurk.
And that's what I found compelling about the Johnson. It made me think conclusion is that it's flagging the same stuff that's happening in introduction.
Yeah,
Johnson, because of his own, he's aiming towards something that's a little more sophisticated than just right. Like even at the conclusion, right, he starts to ask some, I think, interesting non-middle brow like questions. So I think he works well as allows us to call back to the opening, but in a way that raises the stakes for subsequent work. And so I think that's
because if that's the door it's opening is rhetoric is able to examine those theoretical operations that construct these categories rather than rely on them.
Yeah,
these concepts rather than rely on them. And that opens the door to seemingly what we want the third piece to do. The third piece has kind of, it's been, in a sense, it's like this sort of remainder. Every time we do this where there's a remainder, it's like, well, that'll go into the third piece. But it seems like the goal of the third piece is to examine how Mechanical Turk is theorizing these categories or these concepts. I don't know why I keep saying categories.
No, because in many ways, right, there's this near the end of the piece, he writes, and if large language models are in our future, then the most urgent questions become, how do we train them to be good citizens? How do we make them benefit humanity as a whole when humanity itself can't agree on basic facts, much less core ethics and civic values? I mean, it's sort of like, it's like Richard Latham's Q question emerges here at the end of the article. And Johnson essentially gives the weak defense, which is, well, we already know what those are. How do we make sure that, well, but we don't know what those are. And every time, as Min-Soo Kang, right, every time a new mode of communicating and being emerges, you have to rethink those criteria, right? Because those criteria don't exist independent of, right, what we would be calling the taskscape.
Yeah.
Whereas this piece, again, right, Q question, weak defense, Platonic style, right? No, those exist to control the taskscape, but they exist somehow outside of the taskscape. And that's where, right, now we're going to be doing essentially, right, the second piece was looking at how readability emerges in a taskscape. And the third piece is going to be something like, and the evaluative criteria for that readability also emerge in the taskscape, right?
Yeah, no, I think that can work. I mean, we just wouldn't want it to spiral too far.
Yeah,
because what it's doing is putting a button on this as a means to open up the third one. We just wouldn't want it to become its own sort of tangent.
Yeah. So I've got
the good news with the conclusion right now is very brief, so you have room to move.
Yeah. So right now I've got some opening, although my notes say toward a new conclusion, because I get really dramatic in my note, toward a new, like, I look at my notes and I'm like, what an asshole. But
it's tough to pin those down.
It calls back to the sort of the nod to Plato we make in the introduction, and sort of calls back to that. And then,
do we name check Plato? Let's see. It's later we do. I mean, I wonder if, well, no, maybe not until I don't know. I mean, I was just curious if it then would make sense at some point in the introduction to. Even just in a sentence, like there's a latent Platonism in this. Yeah. But I don't know if that comes in the intro or if at the end what you say is what we can see in all this is a latent Platonism.
Yeah.
Plato does pop up, but it's in a footnote and it's later where it talks about the Gorgias, right? This connection between Kukri.
Maybe that can be like a kind of conclusion that regrounds it, right? As rhetoric scholars doing this work, and that may be even like a conclusion kind of note, right? We hear the conclusion, we can't help but note, kind of latent Platonism here, and that Platonism manifests itself in, and then Johnson, and then connect back to the opening stuff, and then but I don't want to do too much. You're right, because don't add new stuff at the end, and save it for the miscellaneous bin that is the third. Right. Fix it in post.
Particularly because we're thinking about starting that third piece with the chess scandal involving anal beads.
Yes.
I honestly, the more I look at that, I'm like, this actually might be a good idea because it's slightly more complicated than just that, but it does, in a sense, kind of bring this circle of, the Mechanical Turk was a little man hiding inside a machine. Now we've got a little machine stuffed inside a man.
I mean, it's clearly not confirmed, unclear how it would actually work, but that's not the point, right? The idea is that the imagination created the reverse situation of the Mechanical Turk, and it's
so fascinating that it's like, you can imagine the audience of the Mechanical Turk saying, well, there's no way a robot could do this. There's got to be a dude in there, right? Yeah. The trick is, where's the dude? Whereas now we're at a stage where it's like, well, there's no way a human could play chess this well. There's got to be a machine rammed up his ass. Right?
Yeah, right. There's no way this teenager, this Twitch guy from America did this. It's got to be anal beads.
It's just such a neat switch from, you know, the judgment being, well, like a machine couldn't play chess that well. It's got to be a dude to, you know, a couple centuries later, a human couldn't play chess that well. It's got to be a machine, you know?
Yeah.
It's so
it's got to be Polish anal beads.
I mean, at this point, that player is, you know, the human Turk. Do you know what I mean? It's like,
which is
great because for that.
Well, and what's interesting is he appears to be like an American. I mean, weirdly, if you like going back to the conversation we had about the exotization and the Orientalism, right? The idea that now it's just an American white teenager,
right,
with a kinky sex toy up his butt, right? That now there's so many ways in which it appears to be the inverse. Yeah.
In fact, we should make a note of that, how the Turk was, using that exoticizing of the East.
Right. So
to say, well, this is a mysterious, but now.
Because it could have been, right, he's got a Apple Watch on, or he's got earbud, or just he's got a computer in his rectum, right? But anal beads why?
Yeah.
Like that.
Well, and the fact that he is, as you say, like a white teenage American with respect to the game of chess, right? Because when you think chess, a lot of times you're thinking, you know, former Soviet Union. You're thinking now a lot of Nordic countries. America's relationship to chess is often, enfant terrible, right? Where it's like, you know, if you think American chess, you think Bobby Fischer, which is problematic because it's also like, oh yes, monstrous racist, genuinely weird dude.
Yeah.
American chess so it is kind of weird that it's like, yeah, now chess is exotic, is a punk American kid.
Yeah.
You know, a Turk playing chess at this point wouldn't be weird. Weird is the American team.
Yes. So the only explanation for it is he's got something that most people would it's also right. Anal beads was just like, there's, you know, at the risk of sounding very white and Midwestern, like, you know, it's exotic for certain people, but other people, like, anal beads are also not the most.
Particularly for that age group, right?
Yes.
I mean, sort of coarse evaluation of younger people when it comes to sexual activity is the seemingly novel acceptance of sex acts related to the anus, right?
Right.
I mean, I don't know how far we'd want to. We'd want to push that. He's about to say, but it doesn't take too long to research butt stuff and this age group, and note that it's far more accepted.
But no, I mean, it is. Yeah, I mean, I think when we were chatting about that, it's beyond just the, you know, juvenile chuckle we probably both had. There's also part of it that's like, actually, no, this is pretty.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Like, for a triptych of articles about this.
Right.
Just the idea of a kind of reversal in the third one.
Yeah.
It raises the whole, you know, I mean, now we got to get Professor Kang back on the line saying, we need you to come back on and talk about anal beads. Are you available?
And he'll be like, well, I have my next book only goes up until, right? Because the first one stopped at what, right after the war or before the war, right?
Yeah, right before the war. I'm doing the war pre the anal bead chess phenomenon.
Yeah, it's like it doesn't go quite. This is going to be the next book because this one's only going up till, you know, the end of the Cold War. So anywho, yeah. So I mean, I think that conclusion, as you say, it's like, and you know, I mean, the sequence may be like in the conclusion, lead with the Johnson, reveal the Platonism, and then that's why rhetoric is primed. You know, it's like, because if there's anyone who's been wrestling with Plato, it's us, right?
Well, I mean, it's those questions, right, that come at the conclusion of that piece. It's like these are rhetorics there are questions, and they're questions that have been asked of us.
Yeah.
And then that way we can say is that, so what we've done in this piece, concluding move, is we've begun to think about how rhetoric can engage from within this, right? And then additional rhetorical work can be the kind of theoretical unpacking of these terms, right? That's future work. And then that's the kind of.
Yeah, no, I think that might work really well.
Yeah.
And there's that neat, it's Détienne and Vernant have that.
Yeah.
I think it's right at the end of their book where they say Plato has never ceased to haunt Western metaphysics. I love that.
Yeah.
Because it underscores, it's like, yeah, I mean, we still have this millennia fight with this dude, but it's because, yeah, he's like a cornerstone, if not the cornerstone of Western civilization. And we've never gotten over it.
Yep.
I bought, I think I have it here. I bought Cunning Intelligence, and it was expensive because it's out of print. It was a few.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it was like a few $100, and I was like, geez.
Yeah, but that's a
I
classic.
thought it was just in broader circulation than that, but I guess not.
Yeah, it's because we've read all the books that cite it. but that may be all the that's the only people who write but for Haughey.
What if, yeah. Well, that's the thing. I was like, gosh, I guess it's critical because I use that book all the time, and I'm like, maybe it's just not as prevalent in scholarship as I assumed it was.
Yeah. So if you actually send me, if you could even scan that passage or the thing around it, that might be useful to drop in.
Yeah, I've got it. I might have it at work, but I've got it because I remember I had to get my department to buy it for me because I was like, I'm not dropping that much on that book.
Yeah.
Yeah, it must be at work. Anywho. Yeah, that's interesting. And intent is always such an interesting canard because like it is both important, particularly in rhetoric where it's like, well, you've got, like audience, context, and purpose. Purpose really speaks to intent because it's like, well, what am I trying to do? At the same time, and this is something, I'm often kind of back and forthing with Ryan about. Yeah, I often don't really care much about intent because it's so occult even to the rhetor, right? Where it's like, well, I'm not sure you could be conscious fully of your own intent, right?
Right. Yeah.
And so there's a certain kind of like, semi-authorial fallacy. It's like, I don't really care what you tried to do. What I care about is what, your texts did, right? I mean, what do they do? So intent is always kind of an interesting thing in that it's like, it's both important because it also enables the things like enables things like lying. If you say intent isn't important, it's like, well, then there is no lie, right? There is no deception.
Well, or you do something like, of course there's intent, but rhetoric would point out, but intent is itself rhetorically constructed. I have intent only insofar as I'm already in this particular situation. But right. No, I worked with, remember Martin Dirksen, the guy we met we wrote a piece in finally it came out in QJS after like 7, but it was essentially about how to come up with a model of deception that avoid, right? The opening of our piece is essentially, right, that all these conversations about agency, right, that typically I think, right, the in rhetoric, generally in rhetorical theory, right, we're accepting of the notion of agency as complicated and distributed, and right, that fight's it's still going, but the probably Jeff Gunn and Lundberg, right, the Ouija board, the Hurdle and Lacona, right, all these sort of, the notion of agency is not this function of a discrete, right, that's accepted, except when it comes to lying and right, what is a model of deception that rhetoric could have?
Yeah,
it isn't grounded in, and so we basically, right, to try to understand that deception is inherent in ecologies as opposed to, but it was it's a difficult needle to thread because when push comes to shove, rhetoric still needs that humanist notion of agency,
right?
Or for any ethical things. Right. But I know you're lying because you meant to say this and said this instead.
Right.
No, you're deceiving me because you intend to do this, but do that instead. But rhetoric largely has complicated that notion of agency, but it slips back. That's where agency's last stand in rhetoric is going to be around notions of lying and deception, because almost every definition we found of it is basically you authorially intend to do this and did something instead.
Yeah.
Even though we understand that agency doesn't quite work that way, but how else could we understand deception? So
yeah,
it was an interesting kind of argument to make. But it goes back to the things that we've added to this draft about the parrot.
Yeah.
I mean, they're kind of, how do I know that you're not a parrot?
Right. I mean,
like,
in a sense, we all always partially are, right? I mean, if your criterion here is, well, the parrot doesn't know what it's saying, it's like, yeah, but nobody fully knows what they're saying. I mean,
and they haven't said it until someone's heard it and made sense of it, right? There's a great moment in here where I forget what it gets said, and I literally wrote in the margins, like, I think this is just passing theory. Right? That's how all, like, I just assume that that ultimately, like, you got to be really careful. I mean, this is my post-human instinct. You got to be really careful not counting some of this stuff as actual writing, because you're going to end up discounting a lot of ostensibly human communication.
Right.
I mean, this is where, like, disability studies would weigh in on this kind of stuff, right? Like, you start talking about how this doesn't count as writing, you get very close to just getting, like, people with autism can't do rhetoric because like, it gets really dicey really quickly.
Yeah. What gets to count as a full human?
Right. That this is, you start using the human as a normative horizon for judging computers, you're going to end up in some weird historical cult. We're like, oh, I didn't mean that. I'm like, yeah, but it kind of really strongly follows from the premise of your argument that, so if I don't know what I'm saying, it doesn't count as a thing I've said. Well, now what about people with trauma? What about people with, right? Like, ooh, now I don't mean to take away rhetorical agency for people with trauma. Well,
under some form of compulsion, or
right, people with cognitive disabilities can't ever reasonably give consent. Ooh, but that's not what I meant to say. Yeah, but
so I mean, I think we can, and as I said, right now the conclusion is sparse, so I think it can bear development, so then that would be that. Otherwise, as I mentioned, as far as I can tell, I cleaned up all the things that were lacking in the bib. I've got it in Zotero here.
My sloppy bib work.
Yeah, there's a thing John Hodgman says a lot of times in Judge John Hodgman. One of his sort of maxims is be mindful of the work you leave for others. Because there are times here where it's like, well, that's why I said I think it's got them all, because sometimes you'll just you'll just say, like, as Smith says, and then you move on. I'm like, what the fuck are you talking about? There's no indication of,
Well, I was going to come back to it.
I'm aware of that, but we got to move forward.
I know.
So as far as I know,
the fact that,
I've run down, and I did find, as I mentioned before we started, about that parrot, Alex. I found not one, but two obituaries, one in the New York Times. I mean, there were many others, but these were the notable ones because, I mean, there was an obituary for Alex in, the newspaper of record, as well as one in Wired, which is, I don't talk about it, but it's neat because that's in a tech website, right? Which is like, it shows the applicability here to our subject matter.
See, I'm glad I didn't do that.
It forced me to do it.
Yeah, see, be mindful of
the moment.
Be mindful of the opportunities I'm creating for you to learn, Jeremy.
You're right. I should be thanking you. So that, and then just like later in the discussion, there were just some others, but I think, and as I mentioned, what I normally do is, and yeah, this isn't a shared, once it's, in fact, if you're going to introduce some stuff in the conclusion, I'll do that. And then normally what I oddly do is print out the bibliography just so I can physically go through and just do a line. I find that works better than, using electronic one and deleting it. That's possible, but I prefer the.
I trust it better printed out.
There was that, and then, and as I mentioned, so all of those footnotes now, or not footnotes, just comments there. These are referencing actual video clips that are now in the system.
Yeah, I mean, there was some good ones.
Yeah, so, like I was doing.
Did you end up, I know you were having because at one point you think your note was just watch the whole video again.
Well, that was the thing, is the cable conversation is really good. It was a little tough to pull a single clip.
Yeah.
And I don't think it searches comments, unfortunately. Yeah, it doesn't. I don't think. Nope. So this one in particular, right? Like the whole piece is about this. So it was tough to just pull a single clip. What I ended up actually doing was it's slightly edited. So yeah, I think it's this one. This is one of this is the only one that says in this edited clip. And if you look at it, it starts with this discussion.
So that's human subjects research, but you're potentially, relying on thousands and thousands of people to answer.
It talks about this first part of the two primary questions and the relationship you have in a broad study and treating them as data points, right? That's this
survey. And your relationship with them is practically nil, right? Like you don't talk to them one-on-one. You have, by design, you don't know who they are, right? And so the relationship piece of that is you're not engaging them, right? As a person, you're treating them as a source of data. And that's fine. Like, I'm not saying that's bad, but I think it's just important. Again, like I said, the two questions are, why are you doing this? And what is your relationship with participants? And so
those two questions are a major kind of component of her entire conversation. What are you doing and what's the relationship? And here she's not specifically talking about our study. She's talking about large end studies where, as she says, you don't have a relationship if you give a survey to 5,000 people.
Right.
And she's like, that's fine. But then in that case, you have to think of the relationship as, are they just data points? Yeah. And, the tenor of the whole takeaway is like, that's fine, but you need to be conscious of those things. Right.
Very clear. Like, for me, in this study, these people are a source of data, and that's it. Right. So let me ask you all a question.
So see, there was that tasteful fade out.
Yeah, I was really worried that you were going to use a star wipe.
Well, that's the funny thing is, like, the tools I was using, it was harder to set up a fade, like a dissolve like that, than it was we got 10 different types of wipes. I'm like, no one uses a wipe.
Yeah.
Why?
Yeah. Who am I, George Lucas?
Right. Yeah. But so this second component of it, and this is the only clip we have where I took something from earlier and blended it with later. Yeah. And here it's actually us talking, because she prompts this question later on where she's like, how can you approach what you're doing through more or less an ethic of care beyond just compensation? Because we had talked about compensation, right? She says it here.
Yes. I just made the conflation of care equals money. What are other ways that you can demonstrate care? Financial compensation.
And we're both, sort of briefly like a deer in headlights. But it's where it literally a little bit, the first thing you say is respecting time. And then a little bit further, you talk about this piece that's right here, where the horror stories. Yes. It makes reference pretty much to why we wouldn't want to invoke trauma. You can tell this is germinal. We haven't thought about it quite as we have in the paper, where it's like, well, this would be a reenactment of trauma.
Yeah.
But it comes up.
Of the hit, so that how much you pay per hit. So in many ways, time, the level of time they'll need to, the level of compensation, but also the kind of level of.
So this is the time bit.
Yeah.
Investment, and I think thinking of, I mean, going back to that example of that Amazon paid me 50 cents to relive my most traumatic moment, is potentially, as we're thinking about the sort of hypothetical hits we're generating, hits, asking of them, right? So do we generate hits that avoid kinds of things, right? And just do, I mean, because we're also thinking about when we talk with Sean Zett.
Anywho, here's where it's thinking about what we put in the paper as why we don't examine trauma from the first piece, right? So anyway, so these clips are there, and each one has to have a title and a description here. We might want to review those, and those are easy to change.
Yeah.
But all of these now, so there's a couple of clips from Kegel. I think there's 3 from Sean. And then I think there's just the one from Ben Hanrahan, but we also used 2 of his pieces in here, so he's represented.
We got him covered.
Yeah, it's just the one clip. About the interface and how it induces relationships. It's interesting because he talks about the interface both in terms of affordances, kind of a Gibsonian, what it does, but also he's like, what's not there in an interface is as important, which is a neat piece. And then this paper, this 2019, they have a piece which is kind of largely about those issues of the interface in MTurk. And I think this is the only time we use this piece, because mostly when we're using Hanrahan, it's the 2021 piece. Which is about that pattern they noticed of, it's about how Turkers make decisions about what hits to select, kind of like alongside what we were doing in this piece. How they make those decisions, and they see a schism between more and less experience, but curiously they see kind of the opposite of what we see.
Yeah.
So in this kind of results, we're sort of hashing out, why do we think that's going on? And that's all from the 2021 piece.
Yeah.
So, the takeaway is, I think the bibliography as of now, what's in the draft is correspondent. And all of those video clips that we noted, those all should be in Manifold, ready to go.
Nice. Yeah.
It took longer than I thought it was gonna, but.
Yeah, no, it's hard to find, because when we look back at them, we tend to compress them like, oh, that was that moment where this thing happened. And you realize like, no, that was a 15-minute exchange.
Yeah.
That's really hard to pull out the,
That really happened with the Kegel one, which is a great conversation, but routinely, like, we'd get into something and then we get on a tangent. It's like, and in text, it's like, well, this is an ellipsis. It's like, it's relevant, but it's not the meat of what I want to talk about here. But in a video, it's like, I felt a little squidgy about trying to make cuts.
Yeah.
And so I wanted it, I was like, well, it's going to work best with a cut, but I want to make sure, I'm pointing out this is edited and, make a visible cut rather than like a cross dissolve where, you can look at it and say, wait, something happened there. Clearly, when there's a fade out, it's like, yeah, that was a cut,
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, particularly at the end, all 3 of us got kind of ramped up by the,
end
of it.
No, it was, yeah. Well, because it really, at that stage of the project, it really got to the meat of what I think that conversation, and that's why we wanted to have it with Kegels. Like, it dawned on us what we were doing.
Yeah.
because the first piece had been sort of like, yeah, we vacuumed up a bunch of shit and then talked about it. But this one was, yeah, the method shift from the first piece to the second piece, I think really clicked in during this conversation.
So, I mean, I think it's in good shape. I mean, I think, as you mentioned, like the conclusion would be that last piece, and then it would just be, read throughs just to, do last changes or whatever. And then I think it's ready to get posted in its next, because I mean, it's already in there in its first draft, but in this format.
And then I guess we make the move to find.
Yeah, contact Jeff and.
Yeah.
Sort of like last time. And it takes a little bit to get this up into Manifold because it would be in separate sections, and then you have to fold in the video links, which are handled slightly differently.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, I think other than tweaking that conclusion, and probably it'll just be a couple of paragraphs. I don't want to add any more because I'll get myself amped up and don't get me going on Platonism. That was the piece that was shared amongst our group about that, how to avoid wrong thinking by having people do philosophy.
Right, yeah.
Like, and then our friend remarking, like, it seems like this was Taylor written just to make Nathaniel mad. And I'm like, it's worked already.
Yeah.
Ugh.
Again, that was something Ryan found. I think it was a new book that was being published, that sort of the pitch. And you never know, because like as authors, when you're in that, you're often kind of sometimes induced to paint it in these sort of more far-reaching terms. If you talk to those authors, they may have a more nuanced claim than it's like, we could have fixed Trump if everyone took philosophy. I guess like that may be the slug line, but it's like, if you talk to them, they'd be like, that's not exactly
what we say. Yeah. But yeah. Anyway, but I think just a quick move that Johnson calls back to the introduction, but I think intensifies the latent Platonism, but I think also calls for rhetoric in that list of questions he has. I think that's kind of what I want to zero in on.
I didn't see that. It was in the Atlantic.
This was in the New York Times Magazine.
Oh, I thought you said it was in the Stephen Johnson.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'll pop in a link
because I'm a big fan.
Oh no, I'm mostly my Stephen Johnson is he always has a last chapter problem. Like he'll make these compelling arguments for a phenomenon, but then he wants to use, the one I always go to is the book on emergence, right? So he makes this super compelling argument of how emergence explains most things. And then he has the last chapter where he's like, and so we should like emergent things better than non-emergent things. And I'm like, yeah, but top-down structures are like you just made this, right? So he makes this really great descriptive case for emergence, and then he wants to use it prescriptively.
Yeah.
So he kind of always gives away at the end, like, no, the implications are actually even more wide-reaching. But so his last chapter is like, so we should like emergent things as opposed to non-emergent things. And I'm like, but what are non-emergent things, Stephen? You've just made a compelling case that emergence is the universe's MO.
Yeah. That's interesting because we were using Ghost Map, which is a favorite in I was doing a team taught section about visualization in medical narratives. And it's a great book, but I remember also there was some dissatisfaction by the or how that one ended. Yeah.
No, Ghost Map is, I always, even if I don't teach it, I still make reference to that as a, particularly when I'm explaining, how research is as much inventional as it is discovery. It's a good example for that. So it's a way I can introduce primary research, but also, how research itself identifies and creates phenomenon. It's basically like the way that I use Kevin Kelly instead of Heidegger, I can use ghost maps instead of Latour, right? So instead of talking about the pasteurization of France, where Latour argues that microbes were invented in a lab, I can just say, ghost map. It's the middle brow. It's the middle brow.
That's what I was gonna say. I mean, he himself is a pop sci writer, where it's,
maybe popular sci. I mean, maybe that's the term. Yeah, we still got to find that. Maybe I'll send out a tweet. I'll tweet Twitter and say, help us with this.
Yeah, it's like if I weren't in academia, I'd like to have a career like his, where he pursues intellectual interests, a lot of times that align with like things that we're doing in academia, but he approaches them, differently. And yeah. So the pressure to churn out books like that, I don't know. I don't think I could hack it.
Yeah. No, that would be, particularly I think early on, too much. Yeah.
He is. I mean, he's prolific.
Yeah.
All right. Well, let's do that then. And then we can wrap this up and contact Jeff.
Push this giant ball of oil out the window.
Exactly.
Okay. Yeah, but I'll get on that conclusion and then add that. Should I just add that to the Google Doc?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I won't shift it over into because Manifold isn't really a production platform. It's a display platform, really. So I don't want to move it over into Markdown until like we're done.
Yeah.
All right then.
Okay. All right, buddy. Good work.
All right.